The American tanks rumbled through the Bavarian countryside like thunder made of iron, their treads crushing the last wildflowers that had somehow survived months of bombing. Greta Mueller pressed her back hard against the stone wall of the field hospital, her fingers trembling as she clutched the letter from Hans. 3 months old now. 3 months since any word from the Eastern Front, where her brother's unit had been swallowed by the Soviet advance like stones thrown into dark water. The acrid smell of burning paper filled the courtyard as she fed Nazi medical records to the flames, page after page. Patient files documenting experiments she'd tried not to think about. Supply requisitions for medications that never reached wounded German soldiers. Orders signed by SS doctors who treated human beings like laboratory specimens. Each page curled and blackened, carrying away evidence of things that should never have been written, never have been done. When the American medic appeared in the doorway, Greta's hands froze. She'd expected soldiers with rifles, barked orders in English. Maybe worse. Instead, Corporal James Torres removed his helmet and approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal. His dark eyes took in the burning papers, the blood-stained walls, her trembling hands, but his expression remained gentle. Water? He held out a canteen, speaking the German word carefully, as if he'd been practicing it. When she didn't respond, he set it on the ground between them and stepped back, his hands visible and empty. Greta stared at the canteen. American water. Probably poisoned, certainly a trap, but her throat felt like sandpaper, and the May sun beat down mercilessly on her grimy nurse's uniform. She watched him tend to a wounded German soldier in the corner, his movements efficient and professional as he cleaned a shrapnel wound. No cruelty, no mockery, just medical care, the same way she would have done it. "Your brother?" Torres nodded toward the letter still clutched in her fist. His German was heavily accented but understandable. Missing? The word hit her like a physical blow. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Mine too," he said quietly in English, then switched back to German. "Philippines. Brother." He continued working on the German soldier's wound, wrapping it with clean bandages. War takes everyone's brothers. The transport truck arrived at sunset, packed with German prisoners who looked as stunned as Greta felt. The Americans had given them food for the journey, actual food, not the sawdust bread they'd been eating for months. An older Wehrmacht sergeant named Müller sat across from her, his face gaunt but his eyes still sharp. "American prison camps," he muttered. "God help us all. I've heard stories from the Eastern Front. Starvation, disease, work details that kill you slowly." Greta nodded, though something nagged at her. The medic's gentle hands. The clean bandages he'd used on German wounded. The way he'd offered water without demanding anything in return. Camp Clinton, Iowa, materialized out of the prairie like a small city with barracks, guard towers, and acres of farmland stretching toward the horizon. But the guard towers weren't bristling with machine guns, and the American soldiers didn't look like the brutal monsters from propaganda posters. They looked tired, mostly young, some barely older than Hans. The processing line moved efficiently. Name, rank, unit, hometown, medical examination, assignment to barracks. Greta found herself paired with Liesel Hoffman, a 19-year-old telephone operator whose blonde hair hung in limp strands around her hollow cheeks. "Don't trust them," Liesel whispered as they were escorted to their quarters. "My cousin was captured by the Russians. They fed him well the first week, then worked him to death in the coal mines. This is just the beginning." But the barracks were clean, not luxurious, just wooden bunks with thin mattresses and rough blankets, but clean. No rats, no stench of human waste. Through the windows, Greta could see American soldiers playing baseball in a field beyond the fence, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like something from another world. That first night, she lay awake listening to the quiet breathing of dozens of German women who had expected to die and instead found themselves in beds with real sheets. When sleep finally came, she dreamed of Hans standing in a wheat field that stretched endlessly under an Iowa sky. The breakfast tray appeared at 6 in the morning, carried by a freckled American private who couldn't have been older than 18. Greta stared at the contents as if they were artifacts from another civilization. Real eggs, scrambled and still steaming. 2 strips of bacon that actually looked like meat instead of the grey substance they'd called protein. Back in Germany, bread that smelled like her grandmother's kitchen before the war consumed everything decent in the world. "It's not poisoned," the boy said in carefully practiced German, noticing her hesitation. His accent was terrible, but the effort made something twist in Greta's chest. He smiled and mimed eating, then walked away, whistling a tune she didn't recognize. Liesel poked at her eggs with a fork, as if they might bite back. "It's too much food," she whispered. "They're fattening us up for something." But hunger won over suspicion, and Greta took her first bite. The eggs were creamy and rich, seasoned with herbs she'd almost forgotten existed. Salt that hadn't been stretched with sawdust. Pepper that actually had flavor. Her stomach cramped with the sudden richness after months of near starvation, but she couldn't stop eating. Later that morning, Major Elizabeth Hartwell summoned her to the camp administration building. Greta had expected someone like the SS officers she'd known, cold and efficient and quick to anger. Instead, she found a woman in her late 30s with calloused hands and laugh lines around her eyes, sitting behind a desk covered with photographs of prisoners and their families. "Do you speak English?" Major Hartwell asked, then immediately switched to careful German when Greta shook her head. "I need a translator, someone who understands medical terms. The camp doctor says you were a nurse." Greta nodded slowly. "Field nurse," she said quietly. "Good." Hartwell pulled out a thick file folder. "We have 300 German prisoners here. Half of them are sick with malnutrition, infections, depression. They won't talk to our medical staff because they don't trust us. Can't blame them after what they've been told about Americans. What do you want from me? Help them get better. Help them understand we're not going to hurt them." Hartwell's voice was matter-of-fact, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "In return, you'll get extra food rations, books to read, maybe some news about German prisoners in other camps. Information about missing soldiers." "Hans." Greta's heart jumped, but she kept her expression neutral. "Why should I trust you?" Hartwell leaned back in her chair, studying Greta with eyes the color of Iowa soil. "Because 3 weeks ago, my son David died on a beach in Normandy, 22 years old. Medic, like Jimmy Torres. He died trying to save a wounded German soldier who had been left behind in a bunker." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Greta waited for the rest, the blame, the hatred, the demand for vengeance that would make sense of everything. Instead, Hartwell opened her desk drawer and pulled out a photograph. A young man in uniform smiling at the camera with his mother's eyes. "David wrote letters about the German prisoners his unit captured," Hartwell continued quietly. "Said most of them were just boys, scared and hungry and far from home. Said they reminded him of the farm kids back in Iowa." Greta stared at the photograph, thinking of Hans's letters describing Russian prisoners who looked like her students from the village school. Boys playing soldiers in a war that devoured children. "I could hate every German soldier for taking my son." Hartwell's voice remained steady. "Some days I want to. But David didn't die so I could become the kind of person who lets prisoners suffer for revenge. He died because he believed in something better than that." That afternoon, Greta found herself in the camp medical station, translating between Dr. Klein and a teenage Wehrmacht private with infected feet from months of marching in rotted boots. The boy kept flinching when the American doctor approached, expecting brutality that never came. Instead, Klein worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the wounds and applying antiseptic while explaining each step in broken German. "Tell him the infection should clear up in a week with proper treatment," the doctor said, then wrapped the boy's feet in clean bandages. "Tell him he needs to keep them dry and change the dressing daily." As Greta translated, she watched the boy's face transform from terror to amazement. Clean bandages, real medicine, a doctor who treated him like a human being instead of vermin. When they helped him to his feet, he whispered, "Thank you," so quietly she almost missed it. Walking back to the barracks that evening, Greta pulled out the small notebook she'd hidden in her uniform pocket and began to write. Not propaganda or official reports, but the truth of what she'd witnessed: American soldiers sharing cigarettes with German prisoners. A camp commander who spoke of mercy instead of revenge. A doctor who healed without asking which side his patients had fought for. The gap between Nazi propaganda and daily reality was becoming impossible to ignore, and each small kindness felt like another crack in the wall of everything she'd been taught to believe. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, crackling through the camp radio like lightning splitting summer sky. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Greta stood frozen in the medical station, a bottle of iodine trembling in her hands as the announcer's voice echoed off the walls in 3 languages: English, German, and what sounded like Polish. Around her, German prisoners reacted in a dozen different ways. Some wept openly, whether from relief or grief she couldn't tell. Others stood silent as stones, processing the enormity of a world without war. A few laughed with the bitter edge of people who had survived something they'd never expected to see the end of. "What happens to us now?" someone whispered into the stunned silence, and no one had an answer. Klaus spoke softly, this teenager from the Wehrmacht, whose battered feet had finally stopped aching. His words came uncertain, the way someone speaks when their entire life has been consumed by war, and now they faced something they couldn't understand. Greta had nothing to tell him. Then Major Hartwell filled the doorway, her composure steady despite the turmoil surrounding them throughout the camp. "You are prisoners of war no longer," she announced in deliberate German. "You are displaced persons now, waiting for repatriation. The journey home will require patience, but you will return. Home." The word felt strange in Greta's mouth, wrong somehow. What counted as home anymore? The field hospital she'd worked in across Bavaria was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. The town of her childhood sat in territory controlled by Soviet forces. Her Berlin apartment had vanished in the February bombing raids. Home meant wherever Hans might be, if Hans lived at all, if he had anywhere left to wait. Transformation came quickly. Red Cross workers showed up carrying thick folders and stacks of paperwork, repatriation applications, physical evaluations for travel readiness, endless interviews to confirm who people were and what they'd done during the war. Greta found herself constantly busy, translating between American officials and German civilians who were beginning to let themselves hope. Jimmy Torres brought her the news about Hans, 3 weeks after surrender. She was in the medical station, cleaning instruments with methodical care, keeping her hands moving while her thoughts traveled dark paths. "New information from the Red Cross," he said quietly, settling across from her work table. His face showed caution, the careful expression of someone choosing each word like crossing fragile ice. "About prisoners, German soldiers captured fighting in the east." Greta's hand froze on the forceps she'd been polishing. "Hans? There's a camp near Stalingrad," Jimmy continued. "Soviet records list a Hans Müller, 24 years old, from the 19th Panzer Division, taken prisoner in January." He pulled a folded sheet from his shirt pocket. "He survived, Greta. Ill but alive. The Red Cross is working on prisoner exchanges." The forceps dropped and clattered across the metal surface as Greta pressed her face into her palms. Alive. After months of picturing Hans frozen in some distant field, after drafting letters to someone who might never receive them, after grieving someone who perhaps didn't need grieving. Relief flooded through her like coming up for air after being underwater too long, bursting from darkness into brilliant light. That following Sunday, Camp Clinton organized what Major Hartwell called an international picnic. American sentries and German prisoners mingled in the central yard, sharing provisions and melodies beneath the intense Iowa sun that burned down on everyone the same way. A discovered harmonica produced folk songs in the hands of a former Wehrmacht man, melodies that sounded identical whether sung in German or American English. Greta sat on a wooden bench with Jimmy Torres beside her, observing Klaus entertaining a group of young American soldiers with a card game that brought constant outbursts of shouting and cheering. The line separating captors from captives had eroded so steadily she couldn't identify when it vanished. Like watching ice dissolve so gradually you only realized the river ran free again when water rushed past. "Try this," Jimmy offered, holding out a dish containing something pink and cold. "Strawberry ice cream. My sister makes the real thing back in Texas, though the kitchen staff here manages quite well." Greta had heard about ice cream, yet never experienced it. The initial taste burst across her tongue, frozen and sweet, thick and impossibly chilled even in the summer warmth. Pure strawberry flavor saturated her mouth, as though she tasted concentrated sunlight and spring water combined, the hint of seasons flourishing ahead. She found herself laughing, a sound unfamiliar from lack of use. Ice cream seemed senseless and wasteful, a decadence that made no logic in a world recovering from devastation. Yet sitting beneath the Iowa sky, hearing old German melodies performed by individuals who'd been adversaries but had transformed into something resembling companions, that spoonful represented the beginning of a future she'd never allowed herself to contemplate. "Not unpleasant," she said, scooping another bite. Jimmy's smile widened. "Chocolate will astonish you." Since American armor had swept through Bavaria, Greta permitted herself the thought that going home could involve more than mere survival of the journey itself. A telegram came on a day when July heat smothered Camp Clinton like thick fabric, draining color from the surrounding prairie vegetation under its merciless force. Major Hartwell found her in the medical station, teaching Claus the proper method for wrapping a twisted ankle, their voices mixing German and fractured English in the comfortable rhythm that had grown familiar through summer months. "Greta," Hartwell said without inflection, clutching the yellow paper as though fearing it would disintegrate. "Red Cross telegram regarding your brother." All existence narrowed to that single sheet of paper. Greta's hands responded instinctively, taking it, opening it, reading sentences that gradually assembled themselves into terrible meaning. Hans Müller, deceased July 2, 1945. Typhus, Soviet prisoner, Camp 47. July 2, 14 days after Germany surrendered. 14 days following, when she'd begun imagining futures including frozen strawberries and letters from distant Texas. 14 days after permitting herself to believe someone from her previous life might make it to whatever future awaited. The telegram slipped from her unfeeling fingers and descended like a withered leaf. Klaus picked it up, his youthful face collapsing as comprehension struck him, reading the German words printed beneath the official English translation. Major Hartwell remained framed in the doorway, her expression hardened as if carved from stone, marked by too many tragedies. "I'm deeply sorry," Hartwell said, the inadequacy of her words like bandaging a catastrophic wound. The Red Cross reports he'd been unwell for months. A typhus outbreak devastated his camp during June. Greta simply nodded, her body performing the motion while her brain struggled with the terrible mathematics of grief. Hans had weathered the retreat from Moscow, survived the horrors surrounding Stalingrad, endured the system's total unraveling. He'd made it through campaigns, destroying millions, survived a brutal winter, remained alive through 5 months in Soviet captivity. Then typhus, an illness that Camp Clinton's doctors could have cured easily with available medications, claimed him 2 weeks following peace. Everything afterward became dreamlike and disconnected. She executed her usual tasks, translating discussions with Dr. Klein, completing medical documentation, distributing correspondence to prisoners whose families continued searching. Yet nothing seemed authentic, as though observing a different person accomplishing these actions while she'd withdrawn somewhere unreachable. Evening brought overhearing American guards discussing matters outside the dining area, their comments traveling through heavy air. One guard from Alabama grumbled about meal quality with clear displeasure. "These prisoners get better rations than our Pacific boys received," he said, dragging on a cigarette with exaggerated resentment. "Actual meat, seasonal crops, frozen treats on Sundays. Hell, my cousin stationed at Okinawa wrote about consuming rice and tinned peaches throughout their deployment." Following orders, the other guard replied, though uncertainty weakened his response. "Orders." The Alabaman spat. "Tell that reasoning to Marines at Iwo Jima while we're babying the enemy. These individuals initiated this conflict. They should consider themselves fortunate we're not forcing them to dig mass graves by hand." Those words penetrated like shrapnel, each striking with precision. Enemy, German, all the decency she'd observed across the summer months suddenly appeared fragile as paper waiting to ignite. If the sentries classified her as opponent, if their consideration meant simply executing directives, what significance did any of it hold? She quit consuming meals. That strawberry delicacy representing hope now remained untouched. disintegrating into reddish liquid beneath dining hall illumination. Rest evaporated. Her thoughts obsessed over every considerate gesture from Jimmy Torres, every reasonable ruling from Major Hartwell, distinguishing genuine behavior from merely performed kindness. Lysel recognized the change first, noticing what bunkmates always did. "You're fading away," she murmured one morning, concerned, like my aunt following Uncle Fritz's passing. She simply stopped, gradually, until insufficient remained to survive. The camp's tentative equilibrium fractured along invisible seams. Kurt Brenner, the former SS officer who'd remained watchful for opportunities, perceived vulnerability like predators sense vulnerability. He positioned himself beside her during the midday meal, his tone quiet and calculated. "You comprehend now," he stated, settling down with studied casualness like spider spinning a web. "The Americans feign compassion when convenient, but we stay their enemies. You've been translating their deception, helping them seem cultured while orchestrating our annihilation." "That's untrue," Greta protested, though her own conviction had hollowed out. "Your brother perished in Soviet hands while you consumed American delicacies," Brenner continued, his voice smooth as venom. "Consider, nurse, what Hans would conclude regarding his sibling assisting those responsible for surrendering German territory to Stalin." The observation burrowed into her like a splinter, impossible to dismiss and impossible to extract without damage. October frost crystallized the Iowa landscape into silver brilliance, each grass blade transformed into temporary treasure. The morning her repatriation documents appeared, Greta examined the paperwork that would return her to Germany. Back toward territory divided among victorious armies, back toward flattened cities, back toward an uncertain future as cold and unstable as the surrounding air. She'd abandoned translating several weeks prior, quit working in the medical wing, ceased maintaining her hidden diary. The carefully constructed connection between American personnel and German detainees had deteriorated without her participation, leaving both groups communicating through uncertainty and fragmented language, carrying more distrust than comprehension. Klaus attempted reaching through to her, bringing modest tributes. A wildflower from the yard, chocolate from his portion, a rough drawing of Hans based on the photograph she'd shared months back. Yet kindness appeared like disloyalty now, every compassionate gesture another proof she'd abandoned doubt while her brother suffered dying in a Soviet facility. "You're destroying yourself," Lysel said one evening, observing Greta moving food around her dish without truly eating. Gradually, like my grandmother following the First War, after the initial one took her sons, she selected guilt over continued survival. Greta didn't contradict her. Guilt demanded fewer choices, demanded nothing from her, required no confidence or possibility of disappointment. Guilt was mathematics. Hans disappeared. She remained, and every happiness post-capture constituted theft from his memory. The evening preceding her departure, Jimmy Torres discovered her in the medical station's vacancy, surrounded by remembered mercies she'd rejected and discounted. He carried coffee cups and sat without asking permission, precisely as he'd done that opening day when she'd burned Nazi paperwork expecting death. "You're carrying his death yourself," he said softly, extending the cup, warming her frozen hands. "Blaming yourself for Hans, for existing here while he ended somewhere distant." Greta fixed her attention on the dark liquid. "He passed while I took pleasure in ice cream and joked with his captors." "His captors?" Jimmy repeated, testing language like examining an injury. "Not your adversaries? How would that be possible?" Her question emerged sharper than meant, edged with accumulated suffering. "You originate from America. I'm German. You represent that faction. My nation lost. Hans paid the consequence while I played house alongside those who imprisoned him." Jimmy remained silent, contemplating. His gaze examined her the way physicians study medical files. After consideration, his voice carried the heaviness of personal anguish. "My brother Miguel perished at Bataan," he disclosed finally, "captured following initial combat, confined on insufficient provisions with inadequate medicine. They pushed him 60 kilometers through Philippine heat, then executed him systematically through work and starvation." He adjusted his coffee cup between his palms. "During medical education in Texas, I studied anatomy safely. Miguel discovered what starvation tasted like. Greta lifted her gaze, struck by resemblance in his anguish. For months, I despised every Japanese individual encountered. Jimmy proceeded. Every Asian person's face became the enemy who destroyed Miguel. But Miguel composed messages about Filipino caretakers who sacrificed themselves for wounded Americans, about Japanese medical workers occasionally distributing rationed meals to captives, about locating humanity within catastrophe. He extracted a worn photograph, two young individuals in everyday garments, embracing, laughing at something beyond the frame's reach. Miguel resolved that hate was a preference. Although circumstance justified selecting it, he selected differently. What did he choose? Greta whispered. Observing individual humans rather than enemy faces, acknowledging universal truth that most people carry fear and distance from belonging and manage through impossible situations. Jimmy stored the photograph away. Miguel's execution happened in Japanese hands, yet he didn't perish despising Japanese people. His final conviction sustained that compassion surpassed retaliation, even remaining his sole resource for giving. The station held only clock-ticking and distant guard movements. Something shifted within Greta's chest, similar to ice beginning dissolution following prolonged frost. "I lack capacity to cease my anger," she confessed. "Begin with someone individual," Jimmy suggested. "Perhaps Claus regarding you like you preserved his existence. Perhaps Major Hartwell, who sustained her bereavement yet chose recognizing prisoners as genuine people. Potentially yourself, for persisting, when continuation carried the weight of betrayal." He proceeded toward departure, stopping at the threshold. The Red Cross recruits German-speaking medical specialists for displaced individual services within occupied areas. Personnel understanding multiple perspectives. Individuals capable of constructing connections instead of barriers. He disappeared into darkness, abandoning Greta with cooling coffee and the crushing force of an impossible decision weighting her ribs like fractured bone.